Thanks for joining us at Right On Replicas, where we're proud to bring you the best scale model kit reviews on the planet. This review covers Revell's Motorsport Series Sox & Martin 1967 Plymouth GTX. It's model kit number 85-4916. It's a skill level 2 kit and was re-released in 2012, but they're still readily available at online auction sites and larger hobby shops. And the kit includes 103 pieces molded in white, clear, transparent red, and chrome. And it features some nicely printed, realistic water slide decals. And it has 2 unbranded drag slicks and front tires. Now, it's a really nicely detailed 426 Hemi engine as well. And it has the 2 4-barrel carbs that were prevalent in the race cars of the day. It also has a separate hood scoop and Keystone style wheels. When you're done, it's about 8 inches long, 3 inches wide, and just over 2 inches high. Now, Sox & Martin, they had won the Winter Nationals and Spring Nationals in 1968, and this Plymouth GTX version was one of the cars that they used for those big wins. They even held drag racing clinics around the country at dealerships, so they're a very popular racing duo who started out as racing rivals. Now, the 426 Hemi, it had that 2 4-barrel carb setup, and it was one of the favorites in the super stock class. Here are the contents of this kit, and you can see that the decals have pretty good register, but we'll still need to do some panel painting to get this to look authentic. And that the tires are separated from the rest of the model by poly bags so that they don't set on them and put any marks on them. Also note that we'll be using mostly Model Master liquid cement for construction, but sometimes super glue for strength and a white or clear glue for the glass. Now, as always, please remember to follow any of the safety and use suggestions from your manufacturers to make sure that you're safe when you use any of the products that you hear or see in the review. Construction begins with the engine's 6 main parts, so we'll assemble the sides of the block there, the oil pan and the engine front and the cylinder heads. And these parts get put together with some good fast setting glue because they position well. The instructions suggest a metallic blue spray, so that's what I used to paint the engine block. And then, since it's already put together, it gives a nice cleaner look and speeds up assembly for the rest of the parts. For some additional detail, I had decided to wire the engine with sparkplug wires. So this was purchased from a hobby shop, but you can get this online from places like Model Car Garage, etc. I started the process of converting the distributor cap by sanding off the top plug points there with an emery board right down to the top of the distributor and making sure that it was a flat surface. And then the center of the cap was drilled out with a hobby drill, about a number 71 bit, and it was drilled about halfway through the part, and the hole was then enlarged a little bit with the tip of a blade. And I removed some material a little at a time and give it more room for the wires to go into position in there. So I painted the distributor cap tan after the hole was drilled there, and then the 8 wires were used for the plug wires. And once it had all dried with some Gorilla Glue, which is like a CA or a super type glue, in the hole, then the wires were bundled together and held tight, then inserted all at once in there, and then I added some glue to set, so that it was good and sturdy. And once in place, I gave it about an hour to dry, and it needs to keep them in place and hold everything securely when the wires get routed. So it has to be pretty good bond there. You can't use regular model glue because it gets brittle and it'll break the wires eventually. Another way to do that would have been to use a pre-wired distributor, but that's not as much fun as this, so we'll continue on. Now we're going to modify the valve covers and The spark plug wires go right straight through the top, as this is a Hemi engine. And so we're going to use that 71 drill bit and drill the little nodes out there that are on top of the valve covers to accept the wires. Now we can route the wires to the spark plug holes from the distributor, and you can use one of the wiring guides for the Hemi engine for this, and then just route them around as they would, pretty much normally go, and then straight into the tops where you'd add a little super glue to keep them in place and secure them in position. The rest of the parts to the engine, the intake, the starter, those are both aluminum, and the headers are steel colored, and the ignition coil is a flat black. Fan is a silver color, and the belt's flat black, along with the carburetors, and those are silver with a flat black wash to bring out the color there and highlight the details. And they were painted with just regular bottle paints. Now the air cleaner cover, I painted that gloss black with some spray paint, and the engine parts all went together cleanly, and they fit into their positions, so no surprises there. Gather these parts from the kit for the interior, and the interiors in these cars are pretty sparse. They were sold as pretty much stripped down model with a huge engine, so the Sox and Martin model isn't any different, but still they're separate pieces, so they're easy to detail with what features are available. To begin, I added some detail to the tachometer. I drilled a small hole in the back side of it and added a piece of colored wire there to look like the feed line, and I glued it in with some CA glue, and then I drilled a little hole out of the top of the dash panel there for the other end of the wire. Now there's no clear marking where this would go, so it should be in the driver's view without obstruction, somewhere up there close to where this one was put. For the seats, I decided to add some detail with seat belts, so I used some of the foil duct tape that's used. It's an aluminum tape with a self-adhesive backing, and I made some of the fittings and clasps for the seat belts with that. And I also used some red 16th inch pinstriping tape and just added it to the ends to provide what looks very much like seat belts when they're in place. So I just cut it to length, added the squares at the ends, and then cut it to size exactly the way I needed it on the seats. The interior is basically a semi-gloss black, and I had assembled and painted the seats, and after they dried I applied those seat belts here, and as it's pinstriping tape, it is self-adhesive, so just put them into place and lay them in there just about where they would sit, as real ones. So as I'd mentioned, the interior is fairly sparse, and spray paint that with some semi-gloss black, and pretty much everything is black. There's some handles that you can detail with a little silver highlighter or a Sharpie pen, etc. But then go ahead and assemble the unit as an interior bucket, and we'll set that aside to dry for later. So now we can add that tachometer that we modified with the wire in the back. Just push it through the hole in the dash that you drilled there with a little dab of glue on it so that it stays into place, and then glue the tack to the top of the dash there too, and it gives a little splash of color, being that it's chrome. Now we can work on some suspension parts here, and as you can see, the rear end assembly is pretty basic. The leaf springs are molded into a portion of the rear axle, so assemble the other half, the pumpkin there, and then the shock absorbers at a normal angle so that they can be positioned later. I spray painted this a silver, and then I gave a little overspray of flat black spray, and so it should look like it's got some specks on it with steel colored rear end. The front end suspension is one piece, and I gave it the same paint treatment as the rear with some steel color and then some specks of overspray on it, and then it fits into place on the chassis with some really clear location points. But remember, when you've got painted parts, you need to scrape the paint, or if they're plated, the plating off so that you get a good bond. Glue will not stick to those, so you want to expose some bare plastic. Now the fit was really good here in the front end, and the rear end also had clear points to place it. The steering gear box up in the front, that's the blue arrow. It's silver, steel colored, and went into the interior tub, and it gets glued into the chassis there. And then there's a clear notch on the frame for placement. The directions say to put the steering box in before the tub, but fitting the end of the gearbox into the firewall is kind of iffy, so if it's put in first, so I'd put it onto the chassis and then into the firewall for placement. So get the parts out for the wheel assemblies. And the front tires and the rear slicks, we're given a quick sanding on the tread on a flat piece of sandpaper, about a 220 grit, and then just pressed and rolled so they look like they've been on the road a little bit. Paint the wheel backings black on both sides, and then assemble the wheels. It's a simple thing. You just put the wheel backs in, and then scrape the chrome plate off the backside of the mag wheels there, or wheels, and then glue those into position and press them together, and you'll have your tire assemblies. Now the front and the rear a little bit different in depth and dimension, so watch for those differences and put those together for assembly later. Get the hood out, and note that there is a die line on the underside there, and a cutting area that needs to be cut away for the air cleaner to stick up through there. Now I used a new blade, and then I put some perforations in the die line, and then I used the blade to cut between the perforations there. And once the circle was made, I removed that by punching it out, and then I used a little sandpaper that's kind of rolled around my finger to smooth out the hole there where it's going to be accommodating that air cleaner. So the induction panel on the hood has two pins that correspond to the placement marks on the hood, and the directions say to drill holes in the hood to accept the pins. However, it seemed better to take the pins off the panel and glue the panel directly to the hood after painting, so that it can be easier to place the panel with the pins. But drilling the holes correctly, you need to use the right size drill once again, and make the panel fit properly into those. So it can be a little touchy. It's your choice which to use, but a lot of dry fitting and some careful drilling will make that easier, or at least more realistic. So it's up to you. Well, now we'll start working with the body preparations, and I'd just give that a light scuffing with some really light sandpaper, at least probably a 600 grit. And then once that's done, you're going to wash the body with some warm water and mild dish soap, and then let it air dry completely. Now the body's painted with first 2 coats of primer sealer, and then that's set and dried for a few hours. And next I gave it a entire coat of I used Duplicolor bright white, and let that dry overnight. Now this is going to be a 3-tone paint job, so you have to let things dry before you move on. And I used some 3M painter's tape to cover everything, and I used it here to cover everything except what I wanted to be painted red. And it's good stuff, and you just need to make sure that the edge is securely buffered down so that it creates a good seal, keep other paint out. Just apply some pressure to the edge and you should have good results, but there's always the occasional touch-up that needs to be done with a small brush. So we can then spray the exposed area with a bright GM red. Actually, Sox and Martin had started out this color scheme with Pontiacs, so they kept the same colors. And then we're going to put a couple of coats on with about 20 minutes between coats. And then after that's done, you let that dry for a couple of hours and remove the tape. And then you're going to pull it away from the painted surface area, so not towards it, to make sure that you don't pull any of the paint up with it. And then we're going to let that dry overnight again. I then taped off the body And I used some plastic bags for the front and back end, and then added the painter's tape. And then two coats of blue, medium blue, were used with the same procedure as the other colors. And then I removed that after a couple of hours, and the whole body again allowed to dry overnight. And you can't rush these steps. Each color has to dry well before you apply the tape to put on the next color, to avoid lifting the paint from what you've already done. So now we have our tricolor paint job. And the last thing to do then, after it's set and dried overnight, is to give it a couple of coats of crystal clear. So each coat gets applied with a nice wet smooth coat, medium speed, and then it gets applied to the roof and the sides and everything to make sure you prevent runs. And then once it's done, it's going to start taking shape as a nicely painted model. And note there's that blue, the hood there, section on the hood that has to be painted separately along with the roof. So go ahead and get all those steps done, and then add the clear and let it dry. I use some of that self-adhesive foil that's available in the aftermarket. Bare Metal Foil is the best brand, or at least the leading brand out there, but there are others. You can find it in most hobby shops and online. And it works pretty simply. You just cut off a strip about the size of the trim or feature you want to cover, and then you stick it into place like tape. Then you rub it down, burnish it into place, and then you trim off the excess with a real sharp or brand new hobby knife blade. Once you've got your trim foiled in position, you can add the front and rear windows into place, and there's some pretty good placement notches here for this. It's got a beveled edge, and so I suggest you use some white glue or some of the crystal clear glue that is used for clear glass windows, and add those into place at this time. Now you can paint the interior of the roof area and the side pillars there. I used some black craft paint there so that I could remove it with just a damp cloth if needed, if it got on anything I didn't want it on. And so go ahead and get that set up. It's up to you, or you can use just some bottle paint, whatever you like to use. Just be careful. We can add the decals to our body now, and with some of the larger decals, I strongly suggest you use some of the aftermarket setting solutions. They're available online or at hobby shops and most larger ones. And plenty of warm water. Make sure that it stays warm. If you're going through your process and your water cools off, change it out and get some more warm water. Put it both on the body and use it to soak the decals. Let them set in there for about 30 seconds to make sure that they start to float off of the backing. And then put them into place, and then smooth them out with like a Kleenex type of tissue. Make sure that you squeeze out any air bubbles or water that's trapped under them. And then once those are done, let them dry overnight, and once again get that ready for the next step of construction. Add the engine to the frame and the drive shaft simultaneously, which will slip into the back end there. So there's good placement points for the engine. Make sure you scrape off the paint, and then just set the motor onto the placement points on the chassis, and just before you insert that finally, then make sure that, and you can use some slow setting glue here to use a little manipulation, and then slip the drive shaft into the back end and the back of the transmission at the same time. Now we can get back to that hood. Like I said, there's a tricky alignment if you do it the way I've suggested. Now the air induction panel gets glued into place there on the hood after the decal's applied, and then it gets lined up to the feature line on the hood. So I used some slow setting glue that was used very sparingly on the inside of the panel and allowed to tack up for a little bit, and then I carefully lined it up and set it into place. Here's one of those cases where my putting this together will benefit you if you haven't done it yet. Because once I had gotten everything together, I test fit the hood for fit on the body, and found that the air cleaner was actually larger than the hole that was provided by the die cut. Also, the wires that were coming up from the distributor gave me a little clearance problem. So what I had to do was turn the hood over and then enlarge the hole for the air cleaner with a Dremel tool, a rotary tool, sanded out the edges so that the air cleaner would fit in there and provide some relief for the spark plug wires. It appears that the kit, since it's a 2-in-1, that the standard GTX air cleaner would fit into the hole provided from the die cut, but not for the racing version air cleaner that they put in this kit. So keep that in mind, and you could do some of this prior, but with the induction hood in place section there, the cowl, it also actually gave me the opportunity to enlarge the holes, but not make sure that it didn't go past those edges. So just keep that in mind if you're going to build this kit. I added the hood hinges into place and a strip across the front, a chrome strip. And there's pretty easy. And then the underside of the hood was painted semi-gloss black, and once that was dry, I added the hinges, and then I scraped off the chrome and the back side of the chrome strip there and glued it into position. And the hinges are specific for the left or right side, so make sure you get those correct. And then test fit the glue, the position before you glue those into place to make sure that they're straight and true and correct on each side. The radiator support and the radiator go together in 3 steps, and once that's done, they're painted a semi-gloss black and dried, and the fit was good, and it fit into the body with no issues, and the radiator hose then fit perfectly in place alongside the cooling can. I used a blue Sharpie marker which has some translucence to it, and I painted the headlights and the running lights with the Sharpie marker on the back side before gluing those into place into the grill. I gave the grill what's called a black wash, and that's simply a 50-50 mix of flat black paint and thinner, and then I used that to brush into the inserts in the grill, and then it was gently wiped off with a soft cloth to bring out the chrome highlights on the top edge. And the front emblem then was painted with some red and blue bottle paints, and the rear bumper was given a wash around the lettering area, and then also wiped with the soft cloth. And the red bumper filler was painted with a fine brush and some red gloss paint. And then the tail lights were installed to make sure that they were on the correct side. The bumper and the filler was a little challenging to put into the body and line up. The filler attaches to the grill and then the bumper to the filler, and there's no real clear attachment points, so they have to be lined up by eye. Took a little time, and I used some slow setting glue here. Make sure you scrape off the chrome for gluing points. And then the rear bumper, it went in pretty easy. Now the chrome has to be removed from that as well, and this will help it bond better, but you're going to need a little eyeball work there in the front end to make sure that that's all lined properly before you let the glue set. Next we can add some of the pieces to the body, and I started with the door handles, and they're so small they're hard to handle, but I used the tip of a drill bit in the depression to break through the paint there, so I had a good gluing spot, and scraped the chrome off of those little knobs that are used to locate them, and then added some glue, just a dab of the slow setting glue, and put those into place with some tweezers. And be very careful, because if they fly out of the tweezers, the chances of finding them are nil. Well, the gas cap door was then put into place like the door handles, same process with by breaking the paint areas there with the end of a drill bit, just to make sure that you get to some raw plastic. And make sure that you line up the hinge from front to back for a proper positioning on the gas cap. The engine compartment now is starting to take shape, and I used that Sharpie marker, the blue one, to add a little tint to the clear water bottle and put that into position. Now the only part that wasn't put on yet was the lower radiator hose. Um, I was not able to work that into position. If this was a competition build, I would have had to find a way, or maybe pre-placed it on the engine before I put that into position. So keep that in mind. It's difficult to install and insert once the engine is in place. Well, there you have it. Body is construction is complete, and here's a shot of the underside. You can see the prominent features are the suspension and those great big slicks in the back, but she looks pretty good. Now the finished model is just awesome, and I couldn't have been happier with the way things went together, except for the positioning of the lower radiator hose and the opening for the hood on the hood there for the air cleaner, etc. Now it looks like she's ready to go. It's got the perfect stance. The dies are pretty clean for this release, and the fit was good. The decals and even the window glass were very nice. The chrome was well done, and the cool Keystone Classic wheels were perfect. It's a great kit to add to your shelf, and if I were you, I'd go out and buy one and do just that. We hope you like this step-by-step premium quality model kit review. And so that you don't miss any more, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. But as always, you can find us on Facebook and at our website, rightonreplicas.com. Thanks.